They were written off as penniless, mocked for accepting a crumbling fortress no one wanted. But when the elderly couple finally opened the stone vault buried beneath 3 feet of ice, what they found inside wasn't just a fortune. It was $360 million in gold, art, and secrets powerful men had killed to possess. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind howled through the mountains of Montana like a wounded animal, tearing across frozen peaks and rattling the thin walls of the mobile home where Margaret and Harold Dawson sat huddled beneath 2 blankets and a prayer. The space heater in the corner coughed and sputtered, barely keeping the cold at bay. Outside, snow piled against the aluminum siding in drifts so high they blocked the lower half of the window. Margaret, 78 years old with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, stared at the stack of medical bills on the folding table. Her hands, spotted with age and swollen at the knuckles, trembled as she sorted through them. Each envelope felt like a stone added to a pile already too heavy to carry. Harold sat beside her, 81, thin as wire, his flannel shirt hanging loose on shoulders that had once been broad and strong. He didn't speak. He just reached over and placed his weathered hand on top of hers. They had been married for 56 years, raised 3 children in a house they lost during the recession of 2008, worked every job they could find, Harold in lumber mills and construction sites, Margaret cleaning houses and working checkout lines at grocery stores that no longer existed. But time had a way of making people invisible. Their children had grown, moved away, started lives too busy for weekly calls. The town of Shepherd's Hollow, population 842, had long stopped noticing them. Margaret was just another old woman buying discounted bread at the market. Harold was just another veteran no one thanked anymore. They survived on Social Security checks that barely covered rent, utilities, and the medications that kept Harold's heart beating and Margaret's bones from crumbling entirely. Some months they chose between heating and eating. This was one of those months. The knock at the door came just after noon on a Tuesday in late January of 2023. Margaret shuffled to the door, her slippers scuffing against the worn linoleum. She opened it a crack, cold air rushing in like an unwelcome guest. A man in a dark wool coat stood on the steps, briefcase in hand, breath misting in the frozen air. "Mrs. Margaret Dawson?" he asked. "Yes." "My name is William H. I'm an attorney with the firm of Bradshaw and Associates out of Missoula. May I come in?" Margaret glanced back at Harold, who had already struggled to his feet, one hand braced against the table for balance. She opened the door wider, and the lawyer stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots. He didn't sit, just stood there in the middle of their cramped living room, looking around at the threadbare couch, the pictures of grandchildren they rarely saw, the cross-stitched sampler on the wall that read "Home is where the heart is." Margaret had made it 40 years ago, when home still felt like more than survival. "I'll get straight to the point," William said, opening his briefcase. "I'm here regarding the estate of Victor Petrov. I believe he was your uncle, Mr. Dawson." Harold's face went still. "Victor? He's dead?" "I'm afraid so. He passed away 6 weeks ago. His body was found in his residence in the Bitterroot Mountains. Natural causes, appears to be heart failure. He was 94. Margaret sank into the armchair, the springs groaning beneath her. We hadn't heard from Victor in decades. "That doesn't surprise me," William said. "Mr. Petrov was extremely reclusive. According to county records, he hadn't left his property in over 30 years. Utilities were paid automatically through a trust. Groceries were delivered monthly. He had no phone, no internet, no contact with the outside world." Harold lowered himself back into his chair. "Why are you here?" The lawyer pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents. "Because Mr. Petrov left his entire estate to you, the property, all structures on it, and all contents within." Silence filled the room. Margaret blinked, trying to process the words. Property? What property? A 6-acre parcel in the Bitterroot Range, approximately 40 miles northwest of here. The structure on the property is unconventional. It's a stone fortress, built sometime in the early 1960s. Mr. Petrov constructed it himself, apparently. Harold leaned forward. A fortress? That's the only way to describe it. Stone walls, turrets, reinforced doors. Local records show he pulled permits for the foundation and basic structure, but much of it was built without inspection or approval. It's been standing for over 60 years. Margaret's throat felt dry. Why would he leave it to us? William's expression softened. According to his will, you're his only living relative. He had no children, no siblings, no other family. His will simply states, to Harold Dawson, my sister's son, I leave everything. Do with it what you believe is right. Harold shook his head slowly. I barely knew him. He came to the States when I was a kid, spoke broken English, kept to himself. My mother said he'd been through hell back in Europe, that he'd seen things no one should see. He showed up at a few family gatherings in the 50s and 60s, then just disappeared into the mountains. And no one went looking for him? Margaret asked. He didn't want to be found, Harold said quietly. My mother tried a few times, sent letters. They came back unopened. William placed the folder on the table. The property is yours, free and clear. No mortgage, no liens. Taxes have been paid through the trust, which has now been dissolved. However, I should warn you, the structure is old, remote, and likely in disrepair. There's no guarantee it's even habitable. Margaret looked at the medical bills still spread across the table. Is it worth anything? The lawyer hesitated. The land itself has some value. Stone structures of that age and size are unusual, so there might be historical interest. But given the location and condition, you'd be lucky to get $50,000 for it. Maybe less. $50,000. It might as well have been $50 million to Margaret and Harold. It could pay off the medical debt, buy them another year or two of stability, maybe even let them visit their daughter in Oregon before time ran out. What do we need to do? Harold asked. William handed him a pen. Sign the transfer documents. The property will be officially yours. After that, you can decide whether to keep it, sell it, or walk away. Harold signed with shaking hands. Margaret signed beside him. William witnessed the signatures, gathered the papers, and stood. I'll file these with the county tomorrow. You should receive the deed in the mail within 2 weeks. If you need anything else, my card is in the folder. He left as quickly as he'd come, taking the cold wind with him when he closed the door. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat in the dim light of the mobile home, staring at the folder on the table like it might sprout wings and fly away. Finally, Margaret whispered, What do we do? Harold rubbed his face with both hands. I don't know. Should we go see it? In this weather? Margaret, we're 80 years old. The roads up there are probably impassable. But if we could sell it, Harold said. That's a big if. Margaret stood slowly, knees protesting, and walked to the window. She wiped the condensation away and stared out at the snow-covered mountains in the distance. Somewhere up there, buried in ice and isolation, was a fortress built by a man no one understood. A man who had chosen them, of all people, to inherit whatever he'd left behind. I think we should go, she said softly, before we're too old or too sick or too scared. Harold looked at her, this woman who had stood beside him through every failure, every loss, every indignity. She was still standing, still fighting. He nodded. All right, we'll go. The next morning, they packed the essentials into their 1998 Ford pickup truck. Blankets, flashlights, a thermos of coffee, sandwiches wrapped in foil, and the folder with the property deed. The truck was old, the paint faded, the passenger door held shut with a bungee cord, but the engine still turned over. Harold had kept it running through sheer stubbornness and spare parts scavenged from junkyards. They drove north on Highway 93, the road winding through valleys where snow clung to pine trees like powdered sugar. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of more snow. Other drivers passed them in newer vehicles, kicking up slush that coated the windshield. Harold gripped the wheel tightly, leaning forward to see through the streaked glass. "How much farther?" Margaret asked. Harold glanced at the hand-drawn map William had left in the folder. "Another 20 miles, then we turn onto a logging road. It's not marked on any GPS." "Of course it isn't," Margaret muttered. The turn-off appeared suddenly, a gap in the trees barely wide enough for the truck. Harold eased onto the narrow road, branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle. Snow here was deeper, untouched by plows or traffic. The truck's tires spun and caught, spun and caught. Harold downshifted, crawling forward inch by inch. "Maybe we should turn back," Margaret said, gripping the door handle. "We're almost there," Harold said, though he had no idea if that was true. The road climbed steadily, switchbacking up the mountain. On their left, a sheer drop disappeared into fog. On their right, a wall of stone and ice rose like a frozen wave. The truck's heater wheezed, barely keeping pace with the cold seeping through the vents. Margaret pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. After what felt like hours, the road leveled out. Ahead, through the swirling snow, something loomed. Harold eased off the gas, letting the truck coast to a stop. They both stared. It was massive, a stone fortress exactly as William had described, but the word didn't capture the reality. Walls of dark grey granite rose 3 stories high, scarred and weathered by decades of mountain storms. 4 turrets stood at the corners capped with conical roofs, now buried under snow. Icicles hung from the battlements like frozen tears, some as thick as a man's leg. Narrow windows, more like arrow slits, dotted the facade. The main entrance was a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands set beneath a stone arch. It looked like something out of a medieval fantasy, except this was real, built by hand in the mountains of Montana by a man who had fled a world most people only read about in history books. "My God," Margaret whispered. Harold killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no birds, no distant traffic, just the soft creak of the truck's cooling metal and the sound of their own breathing. They climbed out slowly, boots sinking into snow that reached their knees. The cold bit through their coats instantly, sharp and merciless. Harold reached back into the truck and grabbed the flashlights. Margaret held the folder against her chest like a shield. Together, they waded through the snow toward the entrance. Up close, the fortress looked even more imposing. The stones were fitted together with such precision that mortar was barely visible in the seams. Each block must have weighed hundreds of pounds. How had one man moved them? How had he built this alone? Harold reached the door and pushed. It didn't budge. He pushed harder, putting his shoulder into it. Nothing. "There's got to be a key," Margaret said. Harold searched the folder, fingers numb inside his gloves. Tucked into a pocket in the back was a single iron key, old and heavy, its teeth worn smooth. He fitted it into the lock. It turned with a groan that echoed off the stone walls. The door swung inward. Warm air rushed out, startling them both. Warm air from a building that had been sealed for weeks. Harold and Margaret exchanged a glance. Then they stepped inside. The interior was dark, lit only by the grey daylight filtering through the narrow windows. Harold clicked on his flashlight. The beam swept across a cavernous great hall. The ceiling soared overhead, supported by massive wooden beams. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, large enough to stand inside. Furniture, draped in white sheets, dotted the space like ghosts. The air smelled of dust, old wood, and something else. Metal, maybe, or stone. "Hello?" Margaret called out. Her voice echoed back at her. "Hello? Hello? Hello?" No response. Of course not. Victor had been dead for 6 weeks. They moved deeper into the hall, their footsteps loud on the stone floor. Harold pulled the sheet off a chair. Beneath it was solid oak, hand-carved, medieval in style. He pulled another sheet. A table, also oak, scarred and heavy. Another. A bookshelf filled with volumes in languages he didn't recognize. "This isn't a house," Margaret said. "It's a castle." They explored room by room. A kitchen with a wood-burning stove and a hand pump for water. A pantry stocked with canned goods, some dating back to the 1980s. A library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, every inch packed with books, history, philosophy, military strategy, survival guides. A bedroom with a narrow cot, a single blanket, a wooden cross on the wall, and everywhere artifacts. Military medals in frames, photographs in black and white showing men in uniforms Margaret didn't recognize. Maps with strange borders and names that didn't match any country she knew. A saber mounted above the fireplace, a trunk filled with letters tied in bundles, written in Cyrillic script. "Who was he?" Margaret whispered. Harold picked up one of the photographs. It showed a young man, maybe 30, standing in front of a palace or government building. He wore a dark uniform with epaulets and medals. His expression was serious, almost haunted. Harold flipped it over, on the back in faded ink, "Viktor Petrov, Sofia, 1952. "He was military," Harold said, "high-ranking by the look of it." "But why come here? Why hide?" Harold didn't have an answer. They continued exploring. The second floor held more bedrooms, all empty except for basic furniture. The third floor was a single large room, circular, located in one of the turrets. The walls were lined with more maps, these modern, marked with notations in Victor's handwriting. Margaret stepped closer, trying to read the notes. Property lines, water sources, escape routes, defensive positions. "He was preparing for something," she said. "Or hiding from something," Harold added. As the afternoon light faded, they returned to the great hall. Harold tried the light switches. Nothing. He checked the electrical panel in a side room. The breakers were all flipped off. He reset them, and suddenly the hall blazed with light. Not electric bulbs, but oil lamps and candles. Victor had wired the fortress with a manual lighting system that drew from a generator buried somewhere beneath the structure. Warmth began to seep into the space as the old heating system kicked on. It ran on propane, Harold discovered, with tanks buried outside. Victor had designed the fortress to be self-sufficient. Water came from a well, heat from stored fuel, food from the stocked pantry. A man could survive here indefinitely, cut off from the world. But why? As darkness fell completely, Harold started a fire in the great stone fireplace. Margaret found blankets in a chest and spread them near the hearth. They sat together, eating the sandwiches they'd brought, staring into the flames. "We should go back," Margaret said. "Come back in the spring when the roads are better." "Probably," Harold agreed. But neither of them moved. The fire crackled and popped. Shadows danced on the stone walls. Harold noticed something odd. The stones inside the fireplace didn't match the rest. They were smoother, more uniform. He stood and stepped closer, running his hand along the interior wall. "What is it?" Margaret asked. "I'm not sure." He pressed against one of the stones. It shifted slightly. He pressed harder. A mechanism clicked somewhere deep in the wall. Slowly, with a grinding sound that echoed through the hall, the back wall of the fireplace began to move. It swung inward, revealing a narrow opening. Beyond it, darkness. Harold grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the gap. A spiral staircase descended into the mountain, carved directly into the stone. The steps were worn smooth in the center, as if they'd been used for decades. Margaret stood and joined him at the fireplace. "He built a basement? Or found a cave and expanded it?" Harold's hand trembled slightly as he held the light. "Should we go down?" Margaret looked at him. In the firelight, she could see every line on his face, every year they'd survived together. "We came this far." Harold nodded. He stepped through the opening, ducking beneath the low stone arch. Margaret followed, one hand on his shoulder for balance. The stairs spiraled downward, tight and steep. The air grew colder with each step. But it was a different kind of cold, not the biting wind of the mountain, but the deep, patient cold of the earth itself. They descended for what felt like minutes, the flashlight beam bouncing off wet stone walls. Finally, the stairs ended in a small chamber. Directly ahead was a door, not wood but steel, thick, reinforced, with a wheel lock like something from a bank vault. Harold approached it slowly. There were 3 keyholes arranged in a triangle around the central wheel. "It needs 3 keys," he said. "We only have 1, Margaret said. Harold tried the 1 key they had. It didn't fit any of the locks. He stepped back, frustrated. There have to be more keys, somewhere in the fortress. They climbed back up, muscles aching, breath coming hard. In the great hall, they stood catching their breath, staring at the fireplace that had revealed its secret so easily. If Victor had hidden one door, what else had he hidden? Where would a paranoid, reclusive military veteran hide keys to a vault? "We search," Margaret said. "Every room, every drawer, every book. If the keys are here, we'll find them." And so they did. For hours, through the night, they searched. Harold went through the library, pulling books off shelves, checking for hollow spaces behind the spines. Margaret searched the bedrooms, lifting mattresses, checking under rugs, opening every trunk and chest. They found letters, more photographs, military documents with classifications stamped across them in languages they couldn't read. They found evidence of a life lived in preparation, dried food, medical supplies, ammunition for weapons they never found, but no keys. As dawn broke, painting the fortress walls with weak grey light, they collapsed in the great hall, exhausted. Harold's chest ached. Margaret's hands wouldn't stop shaking from the cold and fatigue. They had searched everywhere. "Maybe the keys aren't here," Harold said. "Maybe he buried them or threw them away or—" "No," Margaret interrupted. "He left this place to you. He wanted you to find whatever's down there. The keys are here. We're just not seeing them." Harold looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because he waited his whole life to give this to someone. He wouldn't make it impossible." They sat in silence, too tired to move, staring at the fire that had burned down to embers. And then Harold saw it. On the mantel above the fireplace, there was a wooden box he hadn't noticed before. Simple, unadorned, maybe 6 inches square. He'd looked right past it a dozen times. He stood on shaking legs and retrieved it. The box was surprisingly heavy. There was no lock, just a simple latch. He opened it. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were 2 more iron keys, identical to the first, but with different teeth patterns. Beneath them was a folded piece of paper. Harold unfolded it carefully. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age. The handwriting was Victor's. Margaret recognized it from the letters they'd found. "Harold, if you are reading this, I am gone. I am sorry I could not know you better. I am sorry I stayed away. But I had reasons I could never speak. What is below, I protected for 60 years. I protected it from men who would kill for it, from governments that would seize it, from the world that does not understand what it cost to save. Now it is yours. Do what I could not. Use it wisely. Use it for good. The world has enough darkness. Be light. Your Uncle Victor." Harold's vision blurred. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Margaret leaned against him, reading the note over his shoulder. Neither spoke for a long moment. Finally, Margaret whispered, "We have to go back down." Harold nodded. He tucked the note into his pocket, gathered all 3 keys, and together they descended the spiral stairs once more. At the vault door, Harold fitted the first key into the top lock. It turned smoothly. The second key fit the right lock, also smooth. The third key, the one they'd had from the beginning, fit the bottom lock. He turned it, and somewhere deep within the door, Tumblers fell into place with heavy metallic clicks. Harold gripped the wheel lock with both hands. He pulled. It resisted, then slowly began to turn. 1 rotation, 2, 3. With a final hiss of air, as if the vault had been holding its breath for decades, the door swung open. The smell hit them first. Not decay or mustiness, but something sterile, controlled, climate-controlled air, dry and cool. Harold shone the flashlight into the darkness beyond the door, and the beam fell on something that made his breath stop. Gold. Stacks of it. Bars of gold arranged on steel shelves, each bar stamped with markings Margaret couldn't read. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The light reflected off the metal, casting the chamber in a warm, impossible glow. But that was just the beginning. Beyond the gold, sealed display cases held paintings, old masters, styles Margaret recognized from museums but could never afford to visit. There were stacks of currency, not American dollars, but bills from countries that no longer existed, bundled and wrapped in plastic. Coin collections in velvet-lined cases, ancient and gleaming. Jewelry boxes containing rings, necklaces, crowns, things that looked like they belonged to royalty. And documents. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled in Victor's careful handwriting. Bearer bonds, property deeds, certificates of authenticity, inventory lists. Margaret stepped into the vault on trembling legs. "Harold," she whispered, "what is this?" Harold couldn't answer. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. This wasn't a hidden nest egg or a small inheritance. This was a treasury. This was wealth beyond anything he'd ever imagined. Wealth that shouldn't exist. Wealth that men died protecting. He moved to one of the filing cabinets and pulled open a drawer. Inside were ledgers, each page filled with Victor's meticulous handwriting. Dates, items, values, sources. Harold flipped to the final page. At the bottom, underlined 3 times, was a number. Estimated total value as of December 2022, $360 million. Harold's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the cold stone floor, the ledger falling from his hands. Margaret knelt beside him, her own hands shaking so violently she had to clasp them together. "We need to tell someone," she said. "Who?" Harold asked. "Who do we tell? The police? The government? Banks? Lawyers? Margaret, people kill for a fraction of this. If word gets out—" A sound from above cut him off. Footsteps, heavy boots on stone, multiple sets. Harold and Margaret froze. They weren't alone in the fortress anymore. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the stone corridors above. Margaret gripped Harold's arm so tightly her knuckles went white. They sat frozen in the vault, surrounded by $360 million in gold and artifacts, listening to strangers walk through the fortress that had been sealed for decades. "How did they get in?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. Harold's mind raced. They'd locked the main door behind them. The fortress had been empty when they arrived, unless someone had been watching, waiting. He thought of the narrow windows, the high walls, the perfect vantage point the turrets would provide for anyone observing the mountain road below. "We need to close the vault," he said quietly. They moved as silently as 2 elderly people could, Harold pulling the heavy steel door while Margaret steadied herself against the frame. But the door was massive, designed to resist forced entry, and it moved with agonizing slowness. The hinges, despite their age, were well maintained. Victor had kept everything in working order, but they still groaned softly in protest. The footsteps above stopped. Silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Then a voice called out, deep and accented. "We know someone is here. The fire is still warm. Your truck is outside." Harold and Margaret exchanged a look. They were trapped. The only way out was back up the spiral stairs, directly into whoever had invaded the fortress. Harold pulled the vault door shut with a final heave and spun the wheel lock. The tumblers engaged with decisive clicks. "Will it hold?" Margaret asked. "It's designed to," Harold said. "But for how long?" They were in a stone chamber 60 feet beneath the mountain, surrounded by a fortune that men had killed for, with no way out and no way to call for help. Harold's phone had no signal down here. It had barely worked on the mountain road. They were completely cut off. Above them, the footsteps resumed, moving methodically through the great hall. Checking rooms, searching. Then the footsteps descended the spiral stairs, growing louder with each step until they stopped just outside the vault door. A different voice spoke this time, younger, American. "It's sealed. Wheel lock, 3 keyholes, steel reinforcement. Professional grade." "Can you open it?" the first voice asked. Given time, but not quietly. Silence again. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, rapid and irregular. Harold moved slowly around the vault, assessing their situation. The climate control system meant there was air circulation, vents somewhere. The lighting was electric, powered by the same generator that heated the fortress. They wouldn't suffocate or freeze, but they couldn't stay here forever. "Who is in there?" the accented voice called through the door. "We mean no harm. We are friends of Victor Petrov." Harold didn't respond. Friends of Victor? The man who had no friends, who hadn't left his property in 30 years? "We know about the collection," the voice continued. "Victor promised it to us. We have documents." Still, Harold remained silent. Beside him, Margaret picked up one of the ledgers from the filing cabinet, flipping through pages by the dim electric light. The entries went back decades. 1963. Purchases made from dealers in Switzerland, Argentina, Turkey. Victor hadn't stolen these items. He'd bought them, traded for them, smuggled them out of countries in turmoil. Each transaction was documented with receipts, certificates, legal transfers of ownership. "He didn't steal it," Margaret whispered. "He saved it." Harold moved to join her, reading over her shoulder. The story emerged piece by piece from Victor's meticulous records. After fleeing Bulgaria in 1952, he'd spent years working as a consultant for various governments and agencies, people who needed someone who understood the Eastern Bloc, who could navigate the complicated networks of the Cold War. He'd been paid well, and he'd used that money quietly and carefully to acquire artifacts that were being lost in the chaos, sold by desperate families, looted by corrupt officials, destroyed by regimes that wanted to erase the past. Victor hadn't been a thief. He'd been a curator, a guardian, protecting pieces of history until the world was stable enough to appreciate them again. "We will come back," the voice outside announced. "With equipment. You cannot stay in there forever." The footsteps retreated, back up the stairs, through the hall. Eventually, the fortress fell silent again. Harold sank into a folding chair he found near the filing cabinets. "They'll be back, probably with torches, grinders, enough firepower to cut through that door." "Then we need to understand what we're protecting," Margaret said. She pulled open another filing cabinet drawer. Inside were personal documents. Victor's journals, dozens of them bound in leather, dating back to the 1950s. Margaret opened the earliest one. The handwriting was shaky, the English rough. "January 1953, she read aloud. "I am in America now. 3 months. Everything is strange. The language is hard, but I am free. They cannot reach me here. I carry only what I saved. Must keep it safe until the world changes." Harold found another journal, this one from the 1960s. "October 1968, he read. "Bought property in Montana. Isolation is necessary. People ask too many questions in cities. Here I can build, I can protect. Every bar of gold, every painting, every coin. They told me I was crazy to save them. But things have value beyond money. They are memory. They are proof we existed." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. He spent his whole life alone, protecting things for people he'd never meet. They spent hours reading through the journals. The story of Victor Petrov unfolded like a tragic epic. He'd been a military attaché in Sofia, Bulgaria, a man who had access to state treasures and royal collections. When the communist regime came to power, he saw what would happen: purges, executions, the systematic destruction of anything connected to the old ways. He'd used his position to document and quietly relocate items of historical significance, not for personal gain, but for preservation. But the new government discovered what he was doing. He'd fled with nothing but a single trunk of documents and a handful of items he'd managed to carry. For years he'd worked in America, using his knowledge to consult on Cold War intelligence, all while slowly, methodically recovering the artifacts he'd catalogued. Some he bought from dealers who didn't know what they had. Others he retrieved through networks of refugees and sympathizers. By the time he was 50, he had a collection worth millions. By 60, tens of millions. But Victor never sold a single piece. He kept acquiring, kept protecting, kept waiting for a time when the world would be ready to receive these treasures without destroying them or using them as political weapons. He knew what men do for money, Margaret said quietly. He knew governments would claim these items, fight over them, use them as leverage, so he hid everything. Harold turned to the final journal, dated just 6 months before Victor's death. The handwriting was weaker now, trembling with age. "I am old. The body fails. I know I do not have much time. I must decide what to do with everything. Governments will fight, dealers will swarm, lawyers will argue for years, but I remember Harold, my sister's son. Good boy. Worked hard, never asked for anything. Maybe he will understand. Maybe he will be brave enough to do what I could not." Harold's hands shook as he read. Victor had chosen him not because they were close, but because Victor had been watching from a distance all these years, watching Harold work himself to exhaustion at jobs that barely paid, watching him lose his house but keep his dignity, watching him grow old without bitterness or cruelty. Victor had seen in Harold what he'd lost in himself, the ability to trust that good people still existed. "We can't let those men get this," Margaret said. "Whoever they are, they're not here to preserve anything. They're here to profit." "But how do we stop them?" Harold asked. "We're 2 old people locked in a vault." Margaret stood, her expression hardening with a determination Harold hadn't seen in years. "Then we get out of this vault and we fight." She began searching the chamber more carefully. The vault was large, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, with a ceiling 12 feet high. The climate control vents were small, far too small for even a child to crawl through. But there had to be another way out. Victor had been too smart, too paranoid to seal himself in with only one exit. Harold joined the search. They moved slowly, methodically, checking every wall, every corner. Behind one of the artifact cases, Margaret found something, a seam in the stone, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. She pressed against it. Nothing happened. She pressed harder, running her hand along the edge until she found a small indentation about the size of a coin. "Harold, bring me one of those gold pieces." He selected a small gold coin from one of the display cases, a Byzantine solidus according to the label. Margaret fitted it into the indentation. It clicked into place. The seam widened, stone grinding against stone, revealing a narrow passageway. "He built an escape route," Harold breathed. The passage was tight, barely 3 feet wide, carved through solid rock. It sloped upward at a gentle angle. They couldn't see where it led, but air moved through it, cold and fresh. Harold retrieved 2 flashlights from a supply locker near the filing cabinets. Victor had thought of everything, and they entered the passage. The climb was brutal. For 2 people in their late 70s, every step was agony. Margaret's knees screamed in protest. Harold's chest grew tight, his breathing labored. But they climbed, because the alternative was waiting in that vault for men who would tear through the door with power tools and violence. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes so narrow they had to turn sideways to squeeze through. In places, stone steps had been carved into the floor. In others, they had to use iron rungs embedded in the walls to pull themselves up steeper sections. How many years had it taken Victor to carve this tunnel? How many nights had he worked by lantern light, chipping away at solid granite, creating a lifeline in case the world finally came for what he'd hidden? After what felt like hours but was probably 30 minutes, the passage ended at another door. This one was wooden, old and weathered. Harold pushed it open, and cold mountain air rushed in. They emerged in the forest, about 200 yards from the fortress, hidden behind a screen of pine trees and massive boulders. The exit was so well camouflaged that even knowing it was there, Harold could barely see the door once he'd stepped away from it. It looked like nothing more than part of the natural rock face. They stood in the snow, gasping for breath, their legs trembling from exertion. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Below them, through the trees, they could see the fortress, and parked beside their old pickup truck were two black SUVs, new and expensive, with tinted windows. "We need to get to the truck," Harold said. "They'll see us," Margaret replied. "Maybe. But it's our only way off this mountain." What happens next will trap them between armed intruders and a deadly blizzard, force them to trust a stranger who knows more about Victor than they do, and reveal that the fortune is only half of what the old man left behind. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. They waited until full darkness fell, the fortress windows glowing with light from within. Whoever was inside had made themselves comfortable. Smoke rose from one of the chimneys. Harold counted at least 4 distinct silhouettes moving past the windows. They were outnumbered and outmatched. "We circle around," Harold whispered. "Stay in the trees. Come at the truck from the far side." They moved slowly through the forest, each step careful, testing the ground before putting their weight down. Branches caught at their coats, snow soaked through their pants. The cold was intense now, the temperature dropping fast as night settled over the mountain. Margaret's teeth chattered. Harold's fingers had gone numb inside his gloves. It took them 20 minutes to circle around to the far side of the clearing. The truck sat dark and silent, untouched. The intruders must have assumed Harold and Margaret were still trapped in the vault, or had never made it out of the fortress at all. A deadly mistake. Harold fumbled for his keys, dropped them in the snow, retrieved them with shaking hands. He unlocked the driver's door as quietly as possible. The old hinges creaked. Inside the fortress, a silhouette stopped moving. "Get in!" Harold hissed. They both climbed in, Harold turning the key in the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a roar that shattered the silence. Lights blazed on inside the fortress. The main door flew open. Harold threw the truck into reverse, tires spinning in the snow. A man emerged from the fortress, shouting something Harold couldn't hear over the engine's roar. Then another man appeared, and this one had a gun. "Harold!" Margaret screamed. He cranked the wheel, the truck fishtailing as he spun it around. A crack echoed across the clearing. The rear window exploded in a shower of glass. Harold floored the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tires finding traction, and they plunged into the darkness of the forest road. Behind them, headlights blazed to life. The SUVs were coming. The logging road was a nightmare in full darkness. Harold could barely see beyond the reach of his headlights. Branches scraped against the truck. The road dipped and rose without warning. Behind them, the SUV's headlights grew closer, brighter, their engines more powerful, their tires better suited to these conditions. "They're gaining," Margaret said, gripping the dashboard. Harold pushed the old truck as hard as he dared. The speedometer climbed to 40, 50, 55, far too fast for this road for these conditions. One wrong turn and they'd plunge off the mountain. But the alternative was worse. A curve appeared without warning. Harold cranked the wheel. The truck skidded, rear end sliding out toward the drop-off. Margaret screamed. Harold counter-steered, engine roaring, and somehow the tires caught. They straightened out, still moving, still alive. Behind them, one of the SUVs took the same curve too fast. Its headlights swung wildly, illuminating treetops, then sky. The sound of metal crunching against rock echoed through the forest. When Harold checked the rearview mirror, only one set of headlights remained. But that one was still coming. The road descended now, switchbacking down the mountain. Harold knew they were getting close to the highway. If they could just reach it, there would be other cars, witnesses, safety in numbers. He pushed harder, the old engine screaming in protest. The second SUV was right behind them now, close enough that its high beams filled the truck's cabin with blinding light. It accelerated, pulling alongside them on a brief straight section. Harold caught a glimpse of the driver, young, hard-faced, determined. The SUV swerved toward them, trying to force them off the road. Harold yanked the wheel right, toward the mountainside. The truck's passenger side scraped against rock, sparks flying. The SUV pulled back, trying to line up another hit. They were running out of road. Harold could see the highway ahead, cars passing in both directions, their headlights sweeping through the darkness. The SUV accelerated for another ramming attempt. But this time, Harold waited. At the last second, he hit the brakes. The truck's tires locked, and the vehicle slid forward on the icy road. The SUV shot past them, its driver overcorrecting, and the heavy vehicle went into a spin. It left the road, plunging down the embankment, disappearing into the darkness with a crash that echoed long after its lights had vanished. Harold didn't stop. He guided the truck down the final stretch of road and onto the highway, merging into traffic like they were just another set of travelers heading home on a cold Montana night. They drove in silence for 10 miles before Harold pulled into a rest stop. He killed the engine and sat there, hands still gripping the wheel, shaking uncontrollably. Beside him, Margaret was crying quietly, her face in her hands. "We're alive," Harold said, his voice hoarse. "They tried to kill us," Margaret whispered. "Over money, over things. Over $360 million worth of things," Harold corrected. "People have killed for a lot less." Margaret wiped her eyes. "What do we do now? We can't go home. They know who we are. They know where we live." Harold pulled out his phone. Still no signal this close to the mountains, but in another mile or two they'd have coverage. "We call Emily. Tell her everything. She's a prosecutor. She'll know what to do." "And then?" "Then we figure out how to protect Victor's collection without getting ourselves killed in the process." They drove another 15 miles before Harold's phone chimed with a flood of delayed messages. Most were spam, but one was from Emily, their daughter. "Just checking in. Haven't heard from you in a while. Love you both." Harold pulled into a gas station and called her back. She answered on the second ring. "Dad, it's almost 10 o'clock. Is everything okay?" "Emily, we need help. Serious help." Her tone shifted immediately. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Harold looked at Margaret, at the shattered rear window, at the scratches down the passenger side of the truck where they'd scraped rock while fleeing armed men. "We're okay for now, but we need to see you, tonight if possible. We're about 40 miles south of your place." "Dad, you're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared. We're scared. Just, can we come to you?" "Of course. I'll put coffee on." They drove north to Missoula, where Emily lived in a small craftsman house with her husband Marcus, a defense attorney. The lights were blazing when they pulled into the driveway. Emily burst out the front door before Harold had even turned off the engine. She was 42 now, with Margaret's eyes and Harold's stubbornness. She'd been a prosecutor for 15 years, handling everything from drug cases to corruption trials. But she'd never seen her parents look like this, exhausted, terrified, covered in cuts and bruises from their climb through the escape tunnel. "My God, what happened to you?" They went inside, and over the next hour Harold and Margaret told the story. The inheritance, the fortress, the vault, the collection worth $360 million. The men who'd invaded the property and chased them down the mountain. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When they finished, she sat back in her chair. "You're telling me Uncle Victor left you a $360 million treasure trove in a fortress in the mountains, and armed men are trying to steal it?" "Yes," Harold said simply. Marcus, who'd been listening from the kitchen doorway, let out a low whistle. "That's the most insane thing I've ever heard. And I'm a defense attorney." "We have proof," Margaret said, pulling out the folder with the property deed, the ledgers she'd managed to grab from the vault, and Victor's final letter. "It's all documented." Emily studied the papers, her prosecutor's mind already working. "Okay, first thing tomorrow we file a police report. Attempted murder, breaking and entering, armed assault. Get it on record." "What if they claim we're trespassing?" Harold asked. "What if they have documents saying Victor promised them the collection?" "Then they can prove it in court," Emily said firmly. "But we establish your legal ownership first. The property was legally willed to you. You have the deed. Possession is 9/10 of the law." "What about the collection itself?" Margaret asked. "Some of those items, they might be claimed by foreign governments, museums, families of the original owners." Emily nodded. "That's going to be complicated, extremely complicated. We'll need to get ahead of it. Contact the FBI, maybe Interpol. If some of those artifacts were stolen during World War II or the Cold War, there are international agreements about repatriation. But if Victor purchased them legally, kept documentation, paid for them—" "He did," Margaret said, tapping the ledgers. "Every single item is documented. Receipts, certificates, legal transfers." "Then you have a strong case for ownership." But Emily paused, choosing her words carefully. "A collection like this will attract attention. From governments, from treasure hunters, from people who will do anything to get their hands on it. You two are in real danger." Harold and Margaret looked at each other. They'd known it, of course, from the moment bullets started flying, but hearing Emily say it out loud made it more real. "We can't just give it up," Harold said quietly. "Victor trusted us. He protected it for 60 years. We can't let it be torn apart by people who only see dollar signs." "So what do you want to do?" Emily asked. Margaret straightened in her chair. "We want to honor Victor's wishes. Find the rightful owners where they exist. Donate items to museums where appropriate. Maybe establish a foundation. Use some of the resources to help people who need it." "That's noble," Marcus said. "But you'll need an army of lawyers, appraisers, historians, and security professionals. This isn't something two people can handle alone." "Then we build a team," Margaret said. "People we can trust." Emily pulled out her laptop. "I know some people. Colleagues who've worked on asset recovery, international law, cultural preservation. But this is going to take time. Months, maybe years. And you two—" She looked at her parents, at their age, their exhaustion, their fragility. "You need protection. Now." Marcus made a call to a friend who ran a private security firm. Within 2 hours, 2 security professionals arrived at the house, a former Marine named Catherine and an ex-FBI agent named James. They listened to the story, examined the damaged truck, and made their assessment. "You can't go back to your mobile home," Catherine said bluntly. "If these people know who you are, that's the first place they'll look." "We can set you up in a safe location," James added. "Rotate you between secure houses, different places each night. But you need to understand, this is going to be your life until we can identify who's after you and neutralize the threat." Harold felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders. They'd bought an old fortress for what they thought would be a simple real estate transaction, maybe enough to pay off their medical bills. Instead, they'd inherited a target on their backs and a responsibility that terrified them. But when he looked at Margaret, he saw the same determination he'd fallen in love with 56 years ago. She wasn't backing down, and neither would he. "All right," he said. "We do it right. We protect the collection. We find the right homes for these artifacts. And we don't let Victor's sacrifice be for nothing." Emily smiled, pride shining in her eyes. Then let's get to work. Over the next 3 days, Emily assembled a team. First came Dr. Sarah Abbott, a professor of Eastern European history who specialized in cultural artifacts from the Cold War era. When she saw the inventory list from Victor's ledgers, she nearly dropped her coffee cup. "Some of these pieces," she said, voice shaking, "they've been missing for 70 years. Museums around the world have them listed as lost or destroyed. If even half of this is authentic—" "It's authentic," Margaret assured her. "We saw it, touched it." Next came Robert Fisher, an international law attorney who'd worked on cases involving Nazi-looted art and cultural heritage disputes. He reviewed Victor's documentation and shook his head in amazement. This man was meticulous. He documented every transaction, kept every receipt, maintained a clear chain of custody. Legally, this collection is likely yours to control, but proving it in court against multiple international claims? That's going to be a battle. A forensic accountant named Lisa joined the team to assess the financial implications. $360 million is the stated value, but depending on provenance and market conditions, some of these items could sell for multiples of the appraised value. You're looking at potentially $500 million or more. Harold felt sick hearing the numbers. He'd spent his life worried about making rent. Now he was responsible for more money than his mind could process. The team worked around the clock. While Harold and Margaret stayed in rotating safe houses, moving every night, the lawyers filed paperwork. Property ownership claims, police reports about the attack, requests for federal protection of the site, applications for cultural heritage preservation status. Dr. Abbott began the painstaking process of researching each item in Victor's inventory. Paintings by old masters, Byzantine jewelry, Bulgarian royal regalia, Russian Orthodox icons, coins from empires that no longer existed. Every piece had a story. Every piece had people who might claim it. "We need to contact the families," Margaret insisted during one strategy meeting. "If Victor took these things from people who were fleeing for their lives, their descendants deserve to know." "That's going to open a can of worms," Robert warned. "You'll have hundreds of competing claims." "Then we deal with them," Margaret said firmly. "The right way." Emily looked at her mother with newfound respect. All her life, she'd thought of her parents as simple, hard-working people who'd been beaten down by circumstances. But watching Margaret navigate this impossible situation with grace and integrity, she realized her mother had always been strong. The world had just never given her a chance to show it. On the 4th day, Catherine and James had news. "We've identified at least 2 of the men who attacked you. Both have connections to international smuggling rings. They traffic in stolen art, antiquities, anything valuable. They're hired guns, which means someone bigger is pulling the strings." "Who?" Harold asked. "Still working on that, but whoever it is, they knew about Victor's collection, which means either Victor told someone before he died or they've been watching for years," James finished, "waiting for him to die so they could move in." Margaret shivered. The idea that Victor had spent decades protecting his collection from people who were patient enough to wait him out was chilling. These weren't amateurs or opportunists. These were professionals. "We need to secure the fortress," Harold said, "properly, before someone else tries to breach it." Catherine nodded. "We've already contacted a specialized security firm, military-grade systems, 24-hour monitoring, but it's going to be expensive." "Use the collection," Margaret said. "Sell one piece if we have to. Something small, something that doesn't have competing ownership claims. Use the money to protect the rest." Robert pulled up the inventory. "There's a small collection of Roman coins, clearly documented purchases, no disputed ownership. At auction, they'd bring in maybe 200,000. "Do it," Harold said. Within a week, the coins were authenticated, put up for private auction, and sold to a collector for $230,000. The money immediately went towards security. Motion sensors, reinforced doors, camera systems, armed guards rotating in 12-hour shifts. The fortress became exactly what Victor had always intended it to be, impregnable. But the threats didn't stop. Harold and Margaret received anonymous calls on their new burner phones, letters with no return address, messages slipped under the doors of their safe houses, all saying the same thing: give us the collection or you'll regret it. "They're trying to scare you," Emily said. "Don't let them." But it was working. Margaret couldn't sleep. Harold's chest pains returned, worse than before. The stress was killing them slowly, and everyone knew it. Then, one morning, Dr. Abbott made a discovery. She'd been going through Victor's journals, the ones from the 1950s, trying to understand his network of contacts. And she found something. "There's another collection," she said, her voice tight with excitement. The team gathered around the table in the conference room Emily had rented for their work. "What do you mean, another collection?" Robert asked. Dr. Abbott laid out several journal pages, all from 1953. Victor writes about the primary cache and the secondary location. I thought he was just being paranoid, maybe referring to different sections of the vault. But look at this entry from March 1953. Moved the most sensitive items to the secondary location. Too dangerous to keep everything in one place. If they find the fortress, they must not find this. Harold felt his blood run cold. "You're saying there's more?" "I'm saying there might be, somewhere separate from the fortress, possibly more valuable, possibly more dangerous. Victor never specifies what or where, but he references it multiple times over the years." Margaret pulled the journals closer, reading the passages herself. Her heart sank. They'd barely survived discovering the first collection. Now there might be another. "We have to find it," she said quietly. "Why?" James asked. "You've got more than enough to deal with already." "Because if we don't find it, someone else will," Margaret said. "And if it's as sensitive as Victor implied, we can't let it fall into the wrong hands." Emily looked at her parents, saw the exhaustion in their faces, the weight they were carrying. "Mom, Dad, you don't have to do this. We can hand everything over to the FBI. Let them handle it." Harold shook his head. "Victor chose us. Not the FBI, not the government. Us. For a reason." "What reason?" Emily asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "You're 80 years old. You've been shot at, chased off a mountain, threatened constantly. What makes you think you can handle this?" "Because," Margaret said softly, "we're the only ones who will do what's right instead of what's profitable." The room fell silent. Everyone knew she was right. "All right," Dr. Abbott said finally. "Then we find the secondary location, and we hope we get there before anyone else does." The search for Victor's secondary location began in the journals, but it quickly became clear that the old man had been too careful to leave obvious clues. Dr. Abbott spent days poring over every page, looking for patterns, codes, geographic references. Margaret and Harold joined her, reading passages aloud, trying to think like Victor, trying to understand the mind of a man who'd spent 60 years protecting secrets. "He mentions landmarks," Dr. Abbott said one afternoon, 3 weeks after they'd discovered the vault. "Copper Creek, Bishop's Ridge, the Split Pine, but none of these show up on any modern maps." "They might be old names," Harold said. "Places that don't exist anymore, or got renamed." Emily had been working the legal angle, but now she joined them at the table. "What if we approach this differently? Forget the where for a moment. Focus on the what." Victor separated the collections for a reason. What would he consider too sensitive to keep in the fortress? Margaret flipped through one of the later journals from the 1980s. "He writes about documents here, government files, diplomatic cables, evidence of crimes, things that could embarrass or implicate powerful people." "Leverage," Robert said from across the room, where he'd been reviewing ownership claims. "He wasn't just collecting art and gold, he was collecting information." James, the former FBI agent, looked up sharply. That changes everything. If Victor had dirt on government officials, intelligence agencies, foreign powers, that's not treasure, that's ammunition. Harold felt sick. They'd thought they were dealing with a hidden museum. Now it sounded like they'd inherited a time bomb. Why would he do that? Why put us in that position? Maybe he didn't have a choice, Dr. Abbott said softly. If he had information about war crimes, corruption, murders, he couldn't just destroy it. Someone had to know. Someone had to be willing to use it if necessary. Use it how? Margaret asked. To protect the collection, Catherine said, the security professional who'd been listening quietly. Think about it. If powerful people know you have evidence against them, they can't just kill you and take what you have. The information becomes insurance. The room went quiet as everyone processed this. Victor hadn't just left Harold and Margaret a fortune. He'd left them a weapon, and they were only beginning to understand how dangerous it was. Over the next few days, more threats arrived. But these were different. Not anonymous anymore. Specific. A lawyer representing an unnamed client claimed Victor had signed a contract in 1974, promising the collection to a foundation in Switzerland. He produced documents, notarized, official-looking. Robert Fisher examined them carefully. They're forgeries. Good ones, but forgeries. The paper stock is right. The ink is wrong. It's from the 1990s, not the 70s. Can you prove that in court? Emily asked. With the right experts, yes, but it'll take time and money. Another claim came from a Bulgarian diplomat who insisted the royal jewels in Victor's collection had been stolen from his country and must be returned immediately. Then a Russian oligarch's representatives arrived, claiming ownership of several paintings through a chain of purchases dating back to the Soviet era. A Turkish cultural minister sent a formal request for the return of Byzantine artifacts. The claims piled up, dozens of them, some legitimate, some obvious frauds. Each one required investigation, documentation, legal responses. The team worked 18-hour days, but they were being buried under the volume. We need help, Emily said during a strategy meeting in late February. We can't handle all of this with just our small team. Who do we trust? Harold asked, the question he'd been asking for weeks. We go public, Margaret said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. We control the narrative before someone else does. We tell Victor's story. We explain what we're trying to do. We ask for help from people who care about history and justice, not just money. That's extremely risky, Robert warned. Once this goes public, every treasure hunter, every corrupt official, every criminal organization will know exactly what you have and where it is. They already know, Margaret said. The difference is, if we go public, we have witnesses. We have accountability. It's harder to make people disappear when the whole world is watching. Emily looked at her mother with something close to awe. That's actually brilliant. They crafted the announcement carefully, contacted a journalist named Claire Morrison, a veteran reporter known for her integrity and her coverage of international cultural heritage issues. She flew to Missoula within 24 hours of Emily's call. Claire sat across from Harold and Margaret in one of their safe houses, recording device on the table between them, and listened to the story from beginning to end. When they finished, she was quiet for a long moment. This is the biggest cultural heritage story in decades, she finally said. Possibly in history. A single individual preserving hundreds of artifacts through the Cold War, documenting everything, and then leaving it to an elderly couple with instructions to do the right thing. She paused. But you understand what's going to happen when I publish this? Chaos, Harold said simply. Yes, absolute chaos. You'll have governments demanding returns, families claiming ownership, museums begging for donations, criminals trying to steal what they can. Your lives will never be private again. They're not private now, Margaret said. At least this way, we might get some help from decent people. The article ran on the front page of the New York Times on a cold Monday morning in March of 2023. The headline read, "Elderly Montana couple inherits $360 million treasure trove, vows to return artifacts to rightful owners." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the story had been picked up by every major news outlet. By evening, it was the top trending topic on social media. Photographs of Harold and Margaret, ordinary people, working class, elderly, standing in front of their damaged pickup truck became symbols. Hashtags emerged: Justice for Victor, Return the Treasures, Everyday Heroes. But along with the support came the predicted chaos. The phone lines Emily had set up were flooded with calls. Emails poured in by the thousands, people claiming to be descendants of Bulgarian royalty, Russian families who'd lost heirlooms in the revolution, Holocaust survivors looking for items stolen by the Nazis, treasure hunters offering to help for a percentage. Scammers, cranks, and legitimate claimants all mixed together in an impossible tangle. The team expanded rapidly. Emily hired paralegals, researchers, translators. Dr. Abbott brought in colleagues from universities around the world to help authenticate claims and trace provenance. They rented office space, installed servers, created databases. What had started as a small group around a kitchen table became an operation employing 30 people within 2 weeks. Donations started arriving too. People who believed in what Harold and Margaret were trying to do sent money to help with legal fees, security costs, research expenses. A fund was established. Within a month, it had raised over $2 million from thousands of small donors. But not everyone was supportive. Conservative pundits argued that Harold and Margaret should just sell everything and enjoy their wealth. Libertarian commentators insisted the collection belonged to them by right of inheritance and they shouldn't have to answer to anyone. Foreign governments issued formal demands, some threatening legal action if artifacts weren't immediately returned, and the death threats continued, more frequent now, more specific. Catherine and James increased security. Harold and Margaret rarely stayed in the same place 2 nights in a row. They moved between safe houses like fugitives, even though they'd done nothing wrong. The strain was showing. Harold's chest pains grew worse. Margaret developed insomnia, dark circles permanently etched beneath her eyes. Emily watched her parents aging in real time under the pressure and wondered if they'd survive long enough to see this through. Then something unexpected happened. The town of Shepherd's Hollow, the same small Montana town that had barely noticed Harold and Margaret when they were struggling to pay rent, suddenly remembered them. It started with Mabel Peterson, who ran the general store. She'd seen the news coverage, recognized her former customers, and felt ashamed she'd never done more to help them when they'd needed it. She organized a town meeting. Over 100 people showed up, more than had attended anything in years. They discussed how Harold had fixed vehicles for half price when people couldn't afford full repairs. How Margaret had watched neighbors' children for free when parents had emergencies. How neither of them had ever asked for anything in return. "They're good people," Mabel said, "and now they're in trouble. What are we going to do about it?" Sheriff Tom Williams stood up. He was a big man, 58 years old, who'd known Harold since they'd served in the same Veterans Hall. "I say we protect them. They're part of this community. When outsiders threaten them, they threaten all of us." The town agreed. Within days, volunteers organized. Veterans formed a watch committee, taking shifts monitoring the roads leading to any property where Harold and Margaret might be staying. Local lawyers offered pro bono services. The town's retired librarian, a woman named Frances who'd worked with rare books, volunteered to help with provenance research. Even teenagers got involved, managing social media accounts to help spread accurate information and counter false claims. Harold cried when he heard what the town was doing. These were people he'd thought had forgotten him, dismissed him, written him off as just another broke old man waiting to die. Instead, they'd been there all along, watching, remembering, and now rising to defend him when it mattered most. The community support created a buffer that the professional security couldn't provide. Local people knew the area, knew who belonged and who didn't. When suspicious vehicles appeared, residents noted license plates, took photos, called them in. When reporters showed up harassing Harold and Margaret for interviews, locals ran interference, protecting their privacy while still allowing legitimate journalists access to the story. But the biggest surprise came from an unexpected source. Harold's other children, his son Marcus and daughter Lisa, who'd been too busy with their own lives to visit much over the years, suddenly showed up in Missoula. At first, Harold assumed they wanted a piece of the fortune. But Lisa surprised him. "Dad, we know we haven't been around. We got caught up in our own stuff. Thought you and Mum were fine on your own. We were wrong, and we're sorry. But we're here now, and we want to help. No money, no percentage. We just want to make sure you both survive this." Marcus nodded. "I've been reading what you're trying to do. Returning these artifacts, honoring Uncle Victor's wishes. It's the right thing. And I should have been here supporting you from the beginning." The reconciliation didn't erase years of distance, but it mattered. Suddenly, Harold and Margaret weren't alone anymore. They had family, real family, standing with them. Emily, who'd been carrying so much of the burden, nearly collapsed with relief when her siblings finally stepped up. But as March turned to April, a more serious threat emerged. Federal agents arrived, not FBI, but Homeland Security. They claimed that some items in Victor's collection might have been illegally imported, that proper customs declarations had never been filed, that the whole operation needed to be investigated for potential violations of international trafficking laws. Robert Fisher met with them, reviewed their warrants and legal claims. Afterward, he delivered bad news to Harold and Margaret. They have a case. Victor was meticulous about documenting purchases and ownership, but he was less careful about import documentation. Some of these items came into the country in the 50s and 60s when regulations were different, but under current law they could argue the entire collection is contraband. "They want to seize it," Emily said flatly. "They want to seize everything. The fortress, the collection, all of it. Claim it as evidence in an ongoing investigation. And once they have it in federal custody..." Robert didn't need to finish. Everyone knew what happened to seized assets. They disappeared into government warehouses, got tied up in bureaucracy for decades, or got quietly auctioned off to connected buyers. "This is exactly what Victor was afraid of," Margaret said. "He knew governments would use any excuse to grab everything." "So what do we do?" Harold asked. James, the former FBI agent, had been making calls all afternoon. Now he looked up from his phone. "I've got a contact, someone high up in the Justice Department who owes me a favor. If we can prove you're acting in good faith, actively working to return items to legitimate owners, cooperating with international authorities, maintaining proper security, we might be able to negotiate a compromise. They don't seize the collection, but you work under federal oversight." "Oversight meaning they control everything," Catherine said skeptically. "Oversight meaning they can't come after you for violations, and they provide protection against foreign governments trying to seize assets through legal channels. It's not perfect, but it's better than watching them cart everything away in trucks." The negotiations took weeks. Federal prosecutors wanted complete control. Robert and Emily fought for Harold and Margaret's autonomy. Back and forth, offers and counteroffers, legal briefs filed and refiled. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. Agents interviewed Victor's old neighbors, tracked down records from the 1950s and 60s, built timelines of every item's entry into the United States. What they discovered surprised everyone. Victor had been far more careful than anyone realized. For most items, he did have proper documentation, stored in a separate location, in a safety deposit box at a bank in Switzerland. When federal agents retrieved it with proper warrants, They found customs declarations, import permits, tax payments. Victor had protected himself legally, even as he'd hidden the collection physically. The case against Harold and Margaret collapsed. The federal government had no grounds to seize the collection, but the investigation revealed something else: the identity of some of the people who'd been trying to steal it. Cross-referencing Victor's documents with intelligence databases, federal agents identified a network. Former KGB officers who'd been tracking Victor since the Cold War. East German Stasi agents who'd survived the fall of the Berlin Wall and gone into private security. Bulgarian intelligence operatives who'd never stopped looking for their country's lost royal treasures. All of them had been waiting, watching, building dossiers on Victor for decades. "These aren't criminals," James explained during a security briefing. "These are trained intelligence professionals, patient, methodical, and absolutely ruthless. They've been planning this operation since before Victor died, possibly since the 1990s. They knew about the fortress, knew about the collection, knew it would eventually transfer to an heir. And they picked us because we're old and weak," Margaret said quietly. "They picked you because they thought you'd be easy to scare or eliminate," James corrected. "They were wrong." But knowing who they were up against didn't make Harold and Margaret feel safer. If anything, it made the threat more real. These weren't opportunistic thieves. These were professionals with resources, training, and decades of experience making people disappear. The nightmares started then. Harold would wake in the middle of the night, certain he heard footsteps in the hall, reaching for a baseball bat that Catherine insisted he keep by the bed. Margaret stopped eating, her stomach in constant knots. They were winning the legal battles, making progress on returning artifacts to rightful owners, building support from around the world. But they were losing themselves in the process. One night in mid-April, Emily found her mother sitting alone in a safe-house kitchen at 3 a.m, staring at a photograph from Victor's collection. It showed a young Bulgarian girl, maybe 10 years old, wearing an ornate necklace, one of the pieces now secured in the fortress vault. "Mom?" Margaret didn't look up. "I keep thinking about her, whoever she was, whether she survived, whether her family is still looking for this necklace, or if they're all gone. Victor saved these things, but he couldn't save the people, and now we're fighting over objects while the real stories get lost." Emily sat down beside her mother. "That's why we're doing it right. That's why we're taking the time to find the real owners, to tell the real stories. It's not about the money or the fame. It's about remembering that every artifact represents a life, a loss, a moment when someone had to choose between survival and heritage." Margaret finally looked at her daughter. "I'm so tired, Emily. I don't know how much longer we can keep fighting. Then we fight smarter, not harder. We build the foundation, we hire people to handle the day-to-day work, and we let you and Dad step back from the front lines. You've done enough. Let others carry it forward." The next morning, Margaret presented the idea to Harold and the team. Establish a formal foundation, bring in professional management, transition from personal ownership to institutional stewardship. They could remain on the board, guide the mission, but they wouldn't have to personally handle every threat, every claim, every crisis. It took another month to set up. Lawyers drafted papers. The Petrov-Dawson Heritage Foundation was established as a non-profit dedicated to the preservation and ethical stewardship of cultural artifacts, with specific mandates to identify rightful owners, support repatriation efforts, and maintain Victor's collection as a historical resource and educational tool. Dr. Abbott agreed to serve as director. Robert Fisher became legal counsel. Emily joined the board along with several prominent historians and cultural heritage experts. Harold and Margaret remained as founding trustees with final authority on major decisions, but the daily operations would be handled by professionals. The burden finally began to lift. Harold's chest pains eased. Margaret started sleeping again. They moved into a small house in Missoula, Nothing fancy, just a modest 3-bedroom that Emily helped them buy with a small advance from the foundation. For the first time in months, they felt like they could breathe, but the search for Victor's secondary location continued. Dr. Abbott had narrowed down the possible sites based on journal references and historical maps. There were 3 locations that matched Victor's cryptic clues: an abandoned mine shaft near Copper Creek, a cave system on the north face of Bishop's Ridge, and a property Victor had briefly owned in the early 1960s before transferring it to a shell company. "We need to check all 3, Dr. Abbott said, "but carefully. If the secondary location exists and contains the kind of sensitive documents we think it does, we can't risk leading anyone else to it." James put together a small team: himself, Catherine, 2 trusted security specialists, Dr. Abbott, and against everyone's advice, Harold insisted on coming. "It's my inheritance, my responsibility. I should be there when we find it." They started with the mine shaft, spending 2 days exploring abandoned tunnels that went deep into the mountain. But they found nothing except old mining equipment and the bones of pack animals that had died down there decades ago. The cave system was next. More promising, but treacherous, rappelling down cliff faces in cold spring rain, navigating narrow passages, checking every chamber. Again, nothing. No signs Victor had ever been there. That left the property. A 10-acre parcel 40 miles east of the fortress, purchased in 1961, transferred to a shell company called Summit Holdings in 1963. Property records showed a small structure, listed as a storage shed, but no recent activity. Taxes had been paid automatically through the same trust that had managed the fortress. They drove out on a grey afternoon in early May. The road was better maintained than the logging road to the fortress, but still remote. The property sat in a valley between 2 ridges, surrounded by dense pine forest. The structure was indeed small, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, stone construction, partially buried in a hillside. It looked like a root cellar or a bomb shelter. The door was steel, rusted but intact, with a single keyhole. Harold pulled out the key ring they'd taken from the fortress. Tried every key. None fit. He looked at James. "Can you open it?" "I can, but it'll take a few hours and some specialized equipment. Are you sure this is the right place?" Dr. Abbott was studying the structure, walking around it, examining the stonework. "Look at this. The construction technique is identical to the fortress. Same stone, same mortar, same precision. Victor built this." They returned the next day with the equipment. James carefully drilled out the lock, taking care not to damage anything. The door finally swung open with a hiss of stale air. They clicked on flashlights and entered. The interior was a single room, lined with filing cabinets and storage lockers. Unlike the fortress vault with its gold and art, this space contained only documents. Thousands of pages, carefully organized, labeled, preserved in acid-free folders and climate-controlled conditions. Dr. Abbott approached the first filing cabinet with trembling hands. Opened it. Inside were manila folders labeled with names. Government officials, military officers, diplomats. She pulled one at random. Inside were photographs, documents, correspondence. Evidence of corruption, war crimes, illegal weapons sales. The kind of documentation that could destroy careers, topple governments, send powerful people to prison. "My God," she whispered, "this is what he meant by sensitive. This isn't treasure, this is dynamite." They spent hours cataloguing what they'd found. Evidence against dozens of officials from multiple countries, some still alive, still in power. Documentation of Cold War atrocities that had never been prosecuted, proof of international conspiracies, assassinations, coups. Victor had been gathering it for decades, insurance against anyone who might try to take his collection by force. This is why they're so desperate, Harold realized. It's not just about the gold and art. They know he had this. They're afraid we'll release it. "Should we?" Catherine asked. "Some of these crimes, people should know. Justice should be served. But others, Dr. Abbott said, flipping through another folder. Releasing these could destabilize entire regions, reignite conflicts, get innocent people killed. This isn't simple. Nothing about this is simple. They closed up the shelter, resealing the door with a new lock. No one felt right about simply walking away from what they'd found, but neither could they rush into a decision about what to do with it. This required careful thought, expert consultation, moral clarity they didn't yet possess. On the drive back, Harold was quiet. Margaret sat beside him in the back seat, holding his hand. Finally he spoke. Victor didn't just leave us a fortune, he left us a choice, between justice and peace, between truth and stability. I don't think there's a right answer. Then we do what Victor asked, Margaret said softly. We do what's right. Even if we can't always see what that is, we try. That's all anyone can do. Emily was waiting when they returned. She'd spent the day dealing with yet another legal challenge, this one from a private museum claiming ownership of several paintings. But when she saw her parents' faces, she knew something had changed. You found it? Harold nodded. And it's more complicated than we imagined. They gathered the core team, Emily, Robert, Dr. Abbott, James, Catherine, and explained what they'd discovered in the shelter. The debate that followed lasted hours. Some argued for full release, transparency above all. Others counseled caution, selective disclosure only when it served justice without causing unnecessary harm. Still others suggested turning everything over to international authorities and letting them decide. In the end, they agreed on a middle path. The Foundation would hire investigative journalists, human rights lawyers, and historians to review the documents carefully. Anything related to ongoing threats to human life or democratic institutions would be released. Evidence of historical crimes would be made available to appropriate international courts and truth commissions. But documents whose release would serve no purpose except creating chaos would be preserved for historical research with appropriate time delays and security measures. It wasn't perfect, but it was thoughtful, it was ethical, it was what Victor would have wanted. As spring turned to summer, the Foundation began its work. The first artifacts were returned to families who could prove legitimate ownership. A Byzantine ring went back to the descendants of a Bulgarian diplomat. A painting was restored to a Jewish family whose collection had been confiscated during the Holocaust. Each return was documented, ceremonial, covered by media. The public response was overwhelming. Donations to the Foundation increased. Volunteers came forward with expertise in everything from art restoration to genealogical research. Universities offered partnerships. Museums requested loans for exhibitions. Harold and Margaret watched it all from their small house in Missoula. They attended important events, gave occasional interviews, but mostly they let the professionals handle the day-to-day work. They'd carried the burden long enough. Now it was time to let others run with it. One warm evening in June, they sat on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. For the first time in months, they felt something close to peace. "Do you think Victor knew?" Margaret asked. "When he left this to us, did he know what it would become?" Harold considered the question. "I think he hoped. He spent 60 years protecting these things alone, watching the world tear itself apart over money and power. Maybe he wanted to prove that ordinary people like us, could do better, could choose integrity over wealth, justice over convenience. Did we? We're trying. That's all he asked." In the distance, a dog barked. A car passed on the street. The ordinary sounds of ordinary life. After months of threats and chaos and impossible decisions, ordinary felt like a gift they'd never take for granted again. By August of 2023, the Petrov-Dawson Heritage Foundation had returned 17 major artifacts to their rightful owners and identified provenance for over 100 more. Each return was a story unto itself. There was the elderly woman in Sofia who wept when she received her grandmother's wedding necklace, stolen during the communist takeover in 1944. She clutched it to her chest, and said through tears that she never thought she'd see anything from her family's past again. There was the ceremony at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, where Harold and Margaret presented a collection of letters and photographs that had belonged to a family murdered at Auschwitz. The descendants, scattered across 3 continents, came together for the first time in 70 years. They thanked Harold and Margaret not just for returning the items, but for proving their family's existence had mattered, that their losses had not been forgotten. Each return chipped away at the massive collection, but it also lightened something in Harold and Margaret's hearts. They were witnessing what Victor had dreamed of but never lived to see: history being restored, wounds being acknowledged, justice being served one artifact at a time. The fortress itself had been transformed. Under the Foundation's management and with proper security in place, portions of it opened as an educational center. School groups came to learn about the Cold War, about cultural preservation, about one man's determination to protect beauty in a world bent on destruction. Guides told Victor's story, the immigrant who fled tyranny, worked in silence, and left behind a legacy that changed how people thought about ownership, heritage, and responsibility. Harold loved walking through the Great Hall when tour groups visited. He'd stand in the back, unnoticed, watching children's faces as they learned about the journey each artifact had taken. Sometimes a kid would ask a question that showed they really understood, not just the monetary value, but the human cost of every piece. Those moments made everything worthwhile, but the stress of the previous months had taken its toll. Harold's chest pains, which had eased for a while, returned with a vengeance in late September. He'd been lifting boxes of documents at the Foundation office, insisting he could still help with physical work, when the pain hit so hard it dropped him to his knees. Emily rushed him to the hospital. The doctors were blunt. His heart was failing. Years of stress, the recent trauma, the constant fear. It had weakened him beyond what medication could repair. They could make him comfortable, extend his time by months perhaps, but the damage was done. Harold took the news with surprising calm. He'd lived 81 years, survived a war, raised a family, worked until his hands bled, and in his final chapter, he'd done something that mattered. Not many people could say that. Margaret, however, was devastated. 56 years together. She couldn't imagine mornings without him, couldn't picture continuing this fight alone. But Harold took her hand in his hospital bed and smiled that gentle smile she'd fallen in love with decades ago. "You're stronger than you think," he told her. "You always have been. I just got to be there while you figured it out." "I don't want to do this without you," she whispered. "You won't be without me. I'll be in every decision you make, every artifact you return, every time you choose what's right over what's easy. That's not poetic nonsense, Margaret. That's just how love works." Harold came home to their small house in Missoula in early October. Hospice nurses came daily. The Foundation board voted to name the fortress the Harold Dawson Heritage Center. He laughed when Emily told him, "I haven't done anything to deserve that." "You've done everything," Dr. Abbott said. She'd come to visit with several board members. "You took an impossible situation and turned it into something beautiful. You could have sold everything and lived like kings. Instead, you gave it all away. You proved Victor was right to trust you." In his final weeks, Harold received visitors constantly. People whose artifacts had been returned made pilgrimages to thank him. Historians came to interview him about Victor, about the collection, about his own life. The mayor of Shepherd's Hollow drove up to present Harold with a key to the town. Symbolic, sure, but it meant something. The community that had overlooked him for decades now wanted him to know he'd been seen all along. Marcus and Lisa, Harold's other children, stayed close. They'd missed so much of their parents' lives over the years, caught up in their own busy worlds. Now they sat with their father for hours, listening to stories they'd never taken time to hear before. Harold told them about his childhood during World War II, about meeting Margaret at a church dance in 1967, about the years of struggle and small joys that had made up their life together. "I don't have regrets," Harold said one evening, his voice weak but clear. "Except maybe that I didn't tell you all more often how proud I was, how much I loved you. Time gets away from us. We think we have forever, and then suddenly we're at the end, and there's so much left unsaid." "We know, Dad," Emily said, holding his hand. "We've always known." Harold passed peacefully on a cold morning in late October, with Margaret beside him, holding his hand just as she had for 56 years. His last words were simple. It was a good life. The funeral drew hundreds of people, friends from the Veterans Hall, neighbors from the mobile home park where they'd lived, foundation staff and volunteers, people Harold had helped fix cars for over the decades, families whose artifacts he'd helped return. They filled the church to overflowing, spilling out onto the lawn, everyone wanting to pay respects to a man who'd lived his life quietly until history had demanded he stand loud. Margaret stood at the funeral, dry-eyed and straight-backed, and delivered a eulogy that left no one unmoved. "My husband was a mechanic, a veteran, a father, and a man who believed the measure of a life was not what you accumulated, but what you gave away. Viktor Petrov left us a fortune, but Harold's gift to me was showing me that the real treasure was never in a vault. It was in choosing every single day to do right by people even when it cost you everything." After Harold's death, many people expected Margaret to step back, to retire fully and let others run the foundation. She was 78 years old, grieving, exhausted. It would have been understandable, even expected. But Margaret surprised everyone, again. "I'm not done," she announced at the next board meeting. "Harold and I started this together. I'm going to finish it. Not forever. I'm old, not delusional, but for a while longer, until I'm sure it can stand without us." Dr. Abbott smiled. "Then we'd better get back to work." Over the next year, Margaret became the face of the foundation. She gave interviews, attended conferences, traveled to museums and universities to speak about cultural heritage preservation. She wasn't a polished public speaker, didn't use fancy academic language. She just told the truth about an old couple who'd stumbled into something bigger than themselves and tried their best not to screw it up. People responded to her authenticity. Donations increased, volunteers multiplied. The foundation expanded, opening satellite offices in Bulgaria and Turkey to help coordinate repatriation efforts. Partnerships formed with major museums, governments, and international heritage organizations. But Margaret never forgot the personal side. Every artifact that was returned, she tried to be there. She wanted to see the faces of people reconnecting with their stolen past. She wanted to witness the tears, the joy, the healing that happened when history was restored. There was the elderly man in Istanbul who received a collection of Ottoman-era manuscripts his grandfather had been forced to sell during economic collapse in the 1920s. He spent an hour just touching the pages, reading passages aloud in a language Margaret didn't understand, but whose emotion transcended words. There was the young woman in Warsaw whose great-aunt's diary from the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was returned. She'd been writing a book about her family's Holocaust experience, but had only fragments of the story. The diary filled in the gaps, gave voice to a woman who'd died at 23, but whose words would now live forever. There was the ceremony at the National Museum in Sofia, where Margaret presented the Bulgarian royal regalia Viktor had protected for 7 decades. Government ministers attended, foreign dignitaries, media from around the world. But what Margaret remembered most was the elderly woman who'd waited 3 hours in line just to see the crown her grandmother had once worn. She didn't take photos or ask questions. She just stood there, staring, crying quietly, then whispered "thank you" before walking away. These moments sustained Margaret through her grief. Harold had been right. He was with her in every decision, every choice to put people before profit, history before convenience. She felt him most strongly when the foundation faced difficult choices, like when a wealthy collector offered $20 million for just 10 pieces from the collection. The foundation could have used the money, expanded faster, helped more people. But Margaret thought about what Victor would have wanted, what Harold would have said, and she turned down the offer. These items aren't for sale, they're going home. Or when a foreign government demanded immediate return of artifacts without proper documentation or proof of ownership, threatening legal action if the foundation didn't comply. The diplomatic pressure was intense, but Margaret stood firm. We'll return everything that's rightfully yours, but we do it properly, with documentation, with respect for history. Rushing serves politics, not people. Her stubbornness, which had frustrated her children when they were young, became the foundation's greatest asset. Margaret simply refused to compromise on principles, refused to take shortcuts, refused to let expediency trump ethics. And because she wasn't motivated by money or fame or power, people believed her. Governments learned they couldn't bully her. Collectors learned they couldn't buy her. Criminals learned, sometimes the hard way, that she was still protected by people who believed in what she represented. The threats didn't stop entirely, but they diminished, partly because professional security remained in place. Partly because the foundation's work had become so public that harming Margaret would accomplish nothing. The artifacts would still be protected, the mission would continue. But mostly because Margaret had become something more than an obstacle to overcome. She'd become a symbol. By the spring of 2024, Margaret was 79 and the foundation was thriving. Over half the original collection had been repatriated or placed in appropriate museums with proper credit to Victor's preservation efforts. The fortress operated as both a heritage center and an active research facility. Scholars came from around the world to study items still in the collection, to piece together the complicated history of cultural displacement during the 20th century. The foundation had also begun proactive work, identifying at-risk cultural sites and artifacts in conflict zones, working with local communities to document and preserve their heritage before it could be lost or looted. It was exactly what Victor would have wanted, not just returning what had been taken, but preventing future losses. Margaret walked through the fortress one warm afternoon in May, a year and a half after Harold's death. The great hall, once dark and filled with covered furniture, now held display cases with carefully curated exhibits. Families wandered through, reading placards that told the story of each item. Children pressed their faces against glass, marveling at gold coins and ancient jewelry. She stopped at a new display, a photograph of Victor as a young man, beside one of Harold from his time in the service, and between them, a picture of her and Harold taken at the foundation's first anniversary. 3 ordinary people, the placard read, who proved that heritage belongs to everyone, and protecting it is everyone's responsibility. Margaret touched the glass, her reflection overlaying the photographs. She looked old now, she knew. The last year and a half had aged her more than the previous decade, but she also looked stronger somehow, more solid, like she'd finally grown into herself after almost 80 years of becoming. Emily found her there. "Mum, the board meeting starts in an hour. You said you had an announcement." Margaret nodded. It was time. She'd done what she set out to do. The foundation was stable, successful, self-sustaining. Her children were involved now, genuinely invested in the mission. Good people surrounded the work, people she trusted to continue after she was gone. At the board meeting, Margaret stood before the gathered members, Dr. Abbott, Robert Fisher, Emily and her siblings, community representatives, international partners. She took a breath and smiled. "When Harold and I drove up that mountain 18 months ago, we thought we were looking at a broken-down property we might sell for enough money to pay our medical bills. We had no idea we were walking into the biggest responsibility of our lives." She paused. But we also had no idea how many good people would step up to help carry that responsibility. We thought we were alone. We weren't. We never were. She looked around the room. I'm not dying. Don't worry. But I'm 79 years old and I'm tired. It's time for me to step back and let younger, smarter people take the lead. Emily has agreed to serve as board chair. Dr. Abbott will continue as director, and I'll stay on as founding trustee emeritus, which I'm told means I can still yell at you during meetings, but you don't have to listen. The room erupted in protest. People stood, arguing that the foundation needed her, that she couldn't leave, that her presence was essential. But Margaret raised her hand for silence. Viktor Petrov spent 60 years protecting these artifacts alone because he didn't trust anyone else. And you know what? He died alone because of it. Harold and I, we learned something different. We learned that protecting heritage, doing the right thing, building something that matters, it's not something one person can do or should do. It takes communities, it takes trust, it takes believing that other people will carry on when you can't anymore. She smiled through tears she didn't bother hiding. You've all proven worthy of that trust, so let me rest. Let me spend whatever time I have left with my family, in my garden, maybe traveling a little. Let me be just Margaret again, not the guardian of Victor's legacy. Because the truth is, it's not his legacy anymore. It's ours, all of ours. The transition happened gradually over the summer. Margaret attended fewer meetings, delegated more responsibilities. She and Emily took a trip to Oregon, visiting places Margaret had always wanted to see but never had time for. She started painting, something she'd loved as a young woman but abandoned when life got too busy, too hard, too focused on survival. But she stayed involved in the returns. That part, she couldn't give up. When a family in Prague received their grandmother's wedding dress, preserved in Victor's collection for 75 years, Margaret was there. When indigenous artifacts, wrongly taken from a tribe in the Pacific Northwest decades ago, were returned in a ceremony that acknowledged the harm and celebrated the restoration, Margaret stood with tribal elders and wept. She'd become friends with many of the people whose artifacts were returned. They'd send her letters, photos of the items in their new homes, updates on how reconnecting with their heritage had changed their lives. She kept every letter in a box by her bed, reading them when sleep wouldn't come or grief felt too heavy. One afternoon in September, almost 2 years after inheriting the fortress, Margaret sat in her garden with a cup of tea and a stack of those letters. Her daughter Lisa found her there, reading and smiling through tears. "Mom, are you okay?" Margaret looked up. "More than okay. I was just thinking about Harold, about how he'd love knowing where these things ended up. This woman here," she held up a letter. She named her baby after her great-grandmother because getting the family photographs back helped her understand who her great-grandmother was. This man in Turkey, he opened a small museum with the items we returned to his family. He's teaching local children their history. She set down the letters. For so long, Harold and I felt invisible, like we didn't matter, like our lives were just footnotes in other people's stories. But these letters, they prove we mattered, that our choices mattered, that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard and scary and costly, it ripples out in ways we can't even imagine. That evening, the foundation held a gala fundraiser. Margaret rarely attended these events. Too fancy, too many speeches. But this one was special. The first annual Harold Dawson Memorial Scholarship was being awarded to 5 students pursuing degrees in cultural heritage preservation, museum studies, and international law. Margaret sat at a table with her children and grandchildren, watching young people accept scholarships that would help them continue the work Harold and Victor had started. They were so earnest, so passionate, so convinced they could make a difference, just like she and Harold had been in their own quiet way. When Dr. Abbott invited Margaret to say a few words, she didn't refuse. She walked slowly to the stage, accepted the microphone, and looked out at the crowd. over 300 people who'd paid to support the Foundation's work. My husband believed in the quiet heroism of ordinary people, she began. He believed that you didn't need to be rich or powerful or special to do good in the world. You just needed to care enough to try. She smiled. We were two old people who could barely afford heat in the winter. And somehow, we ended up responsible for $360 million in historical artifacts. If that doesn't prove God has a sense of humor, I don't know what does. The audience laughed. Margaret continued, "But here's what I've learned. It was never about the money. It was about the stories. Every artifact Victor saved, every item we've returned, it represents a human being who lived, who loved, who lost something precious. And when we give those things back, we're not just returning objects. We're saying, you mattered. Your story mattered. Your loss was real, and we haven't forgotten." She gripped the podium, her voice strengthening. "So to these young people receiving scholarships tonight, I want you to remember that. When the work gets hard, when governments push back, when money gets tight, when people tell you it's not worth it, remember that every artifact is a person, every return is a healing, and every choice you make to protect heritage instead of profiting from it is a choice that ripples forward in ways you'll never fully see." The applause was thunderous. Margaret returned to her seat, exhausted but satisfied. Emily leaned over and whispered, "Dad would be so proud." "He is," Margaret said simply. "I feel it every day." As autumn deepened into winter and 2024 drew to a close, the Foundation announced a major milestone. 3/4 of Victor's original collection had been properly distributed, returned to families, placed in museums, documented for history. The remaining quarter would stay at the fortress as a permanent exhibition and research collection, available to scholars and the public. The fortress itself had become a destination. Thousands of visitors came each year, not because it was fancy or glamorous, but because it told a story people needed to hear. A story about an immigrant who fled tyranny and spent his life protecting beauty. About an elderly couple who inherited a burden and transformed it into a blessing. About communities coming together to do what's right instead of what's profitable. Margaret attended the 2-year anniversary celebration in December. She moved slowly now, needed a cane, tired easily, but her mind was sharp and her spirit unbroken. When someone asked if she had any regrets, she didn't hesitate. Only that Victor never got to see this. He died thinking he'd failed, thinking the collection would be seized or stolen or lost. He never knew that ordinary people like Harold and me, with help from extraordinary people like all of you, would prove him wrong. Would prove that goodness still exists, that courage still matters, that doing the right thing, even when it costs you everything, is always worth it. That night, alone in her house, Margaret opened the box of letters again. She'd received a new one that day from a young man in Bulgaria. His family's confiscated property deeds had been found in the secondary location, in Victor's cache of documents. With proper documentation finally in hand, they'd been able to reclaim land that had been stolen 70 years ago. The young man wrote, "Because of you, my children will grow up knowing where they come from. They will walk on land their great-great-grandparents walked. They will know their roots. Thank you for giving us back our history." Margaret held the letter to her chest and cried, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. Grateful she and Harold had said yes when it would have been easier to say no. Grateful they'd fought when it would have been safer to surrender. Grateful they'd lived long enough to see the difference one choice could make. Anyone can change the world if they're stubborn enough to try and brave enough to care more about doing right than staying comfortable. As snow fell softly outside her window, Margaret Dawson sat in her modest home surrounded by letters from people whose lives had been changed by artifacts returned, histories restored, wounds acknowledged. The mechanic's wife, who'd once counted pennies to buy discounted bread, had become a voice for the voiceless, a champion for the forgotten, proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to look away from what's right. She thought of Harold, gone now but never absent. Thought of Victor, the lonely guardian who'd gambled everything on hope. Thought of the fortress standing strong against the Montana winter, lights glowing warm in its windows, welcoming visitors who came to remember that heritage belongs to everyone and protecting it is everyone's sacred duty. Because for Margaret and for everyone who would carry the mission forward, the story wasn't about gold or jewels or priceless paintings. It was about something far more valuable: the courage to stand up when the world expected you to sit down, the strength to give when others only took, and the faith that one person's choice to care could ripple forward into generations of healing. And in that small house in Missoula, as an old woman drifted off to sleep surrounded by proof that her life had mattered, the fortress stood on its mountain, no longer a tomb of secrets, but a beacon of hope, reminding anyone who would listen that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in vaults. They're found in the hearts of people brave enough to believe that doing right is reward enough. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe ordinary people can do extraordinary things.